Layers of causes in World War I. So when we look at the causes of the war, they start simple and they're actually a lot more complicated. So at its basic level, the simplest description is that after the attack in Serbia, Austria-Hungary made a set of demands on Serbia that Serbia could not accept, and wanted to wage basically a punitive expedition. Russia, Serbia's ally, wouldn't sit if Austria-Hungary involved itself in Serbia. With Serbia's sovereignty threatened, with Serbia under attack, basically, as soon as Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia comes to the aid of Serbia and declares war on Austria, which requires Germany to declare war on Russia, which requires France to declare war on Germany, and Austria coming to the aid of its ally, Russia. And Britain, of course, not necessarily pulled in yet, but of course Germany's willingness to move through Belgium and violate its neutrality is the final straw, which brings Britain into the war. And so quickly, over a span of 1 month, you have development of a large conflict. Now, that's great, and at its very basic, yeah, these entangling alliances certainly had its role. When you look sort of further, it's beyond that. So ask yourself as you read through the Keegan book, who's really running these countries? Because it seems that the leaders of the countries are actually trying to stem the tide. We see Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria say, limit this to a Serbian war. The Russians are trying to limit it to a Serbian war, according to the Tsar. The Germans, or even the Kaiser, wants to sort of limit this to a Serbian war while he pledges support. So as we go through this month of mobilization, it starts with the leaders all sort of circling. And what we see is that the common thread is that we have the leaders of the military who are pushing, and some other civil servants and ambassadors pushing actually for war. And Keegan pulls a quotation, I think, that's quite fitting. A quotation about which he says, better than any other document of the crisis of July 1914, the state of mind which possessed the military professionals of the age. And this was here. He says, it is absolutely necessary for the government to understand that starting with this evening, any delay of 24 hours in calling up our reservists and issuing orders prescribing covering operations will have as its result the withdrawal of our concentration points by from 15 to 25 kilometers for each day of delay. In other words, the abandonment of just that much of our territory. The Commander-in-Chief must decline to accept this responsibility. So, as Keegan said, the loss of advantage was a fear that now afflicted him as acutely as it had Januszkiewicz on July 29 and Moltke on July 30th. He foresaw the secret approach of German troops to their deployment positions, while his own soldiers were still in the barracks. German reservists kitting out at their depots while his were still at home. On the afternoon of Friday, 31 July, he handed to Messimy, the Minister of War, a short note which epitomizes, better than any other document of the crisis July 1914, of the state of mind which possessed the military professionals of the age. Keegan then says that evening he formally requested the President to order general mobilization at once. His representation was debated by the Cabinet the next morning, and the first day of mobilization to be August 2nd, proclaimed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So that is the French and the Russians. So understanding that the military professionals and some of these bureaucrats are pushing for mobilization. And so why is that? So on June 27, 1914, we have the assassination, right? And then by July 2, so fairly quickly, you have finally the confession from the assassins. is at that time, Austrians are already pushing for a punitive campaign and placing a number of demands on Serbia. Now, some of the bureaucrats don't want Serbia to assert themselves and see Serbia as a prime target, and that Austria could go in and really show Serbia who's boss. And it fit some of their needs. On the other hand, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, as well as the Prince of Hungary, had no interest in this. They foresaw a few problems. One, that this would have involved a series of changes which they weren't willing to embrace. Of course, what happens if they fight this war to a draw of some kind, or not a very big win, or if it's mediated? There's a very good possibility that instead of just having a dual empire, they might have a triple empire in which Serbia is the new 1/3. Meaning they'd have to share have yet another joint monarch, and Serbia would be one of them. So they didn't want that. The Hungarian, Count Tiza didn't want that. So the leaders don't really want this. They think that it could also embolden the Slavs who already live within the borders. So that's not their interest. It's the ambassador, Berchtold, who is moving very quickly. Is Berchtold, who's told of Germany's full support for Austria. And even General von Falkenhayn was told not to take preparatory measures because they may be seen as a provocation. So it frustrates von Falkenhayn, but he has to listen to orders. On July 7th, Austrian Council of Ministers meets, and in the previous war they came to the conclusion that Austria had mobilized twice against Serbia in 1909 and earlier, and never had there been outside intervention. The Russians never involved themselves. They sat it out. So this might be a localized war. Count Tiza wants notice of demands sent to Serbia, and demands that are meetable. What he's looking for is a simple and peaceful resolution that gives Austria what it wants, Austria-Hungary what it wants, or at least most of the things it wants, without the cost or danger of invoking a war. And he had to go through they had to go through a number of hoops to get Tiza to agree, and one was a not an ultimatum saying do this or else face reprisal from the Austro-Hungarian military, but just a deadline. At the same time, they wanted to deliver that note on July 12th after writing it. They couldn't, because at the same time, the president of France, Henri Poincaré, was visiting Russia for 1 week. So clearly, with the events of Europe happening at that time, they were going to be discussing possible military action, I'm sure. The Austrians figured they would, and even if they weren't, delivering such a note in the middle of that period of time, Poincaré is visiting the Tsar, would mean that two heads of state, two allies, would have a week, because he was planning to stay a week, to confer and plan and strategize how they would respond. And so that would leave Austria at a disadvantage. So they had to wait. Originally, Poincaré was scheduled to leave Russia on July 25th. He actually they found out he was actually leaving on July 23rd. After he leaves, the Austrians deliver the ultimatum to Serbia. On July 25th, Serbia was leading towards acquiescence. They had the note. They were well within their 48-hour deadline. They were thinking of basically caving to every single demand and, allowing this to go on. It would be humiliating, but it would avoid war. Until they talked with the Russians. And the Russians told them that they feel very much for Serbia and Slavs, and they announced the Russians announced something known as a period preparatory to war. This isn't a mobilization of troops, but it's calling for preparedness from the regular army. Eventually, that could lead to a mobilization. Well, was no eventually about it. On July 26th and 27th, emboldened by Russia's support, on the 25th, Serbia declined meeting all of those demands and answered Austria rather hostilely. All Austria was looking to do, as you'll be reading those expectations. On July 26th and 27th, Serbia mobilized its army, and Russia started calling up its reservists. On July 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia. So the Russians start planning for general mobilization of soldiers. The problem is that general mobilization, they'd already started calling up reservists. The problem with general mobilization is that the minute they see that, Germany will become involved. Now, I want you to think of this. So all of these states are moving their armies, and presidents are being pressured on the one hand by their ambassadors and their generals and everything else. And is it just that they're war hawks, that they really just got to have a war? It could be, but what we'll see is there's also a real practical reason as to why they were endorsing this. And so what happens is that you have the Russians decide to only partially mobilize after the Austrian declaration of war. And then the Tsar goes off and does his summer things. It's only after sort of being constantly asked about it by his bureaucrats and influenced that he eventually decides, okay, general mobilization. So Russia, on the 29th, was going to declare general mobilization, turned it to partial, and then by afternoon on the 30th, turned partial mobilization to general mobilization of the army. Okay, mobilizing is not a declaration of war, but it means you're moving your army to a certain spot. On July 31st, Germany, understanding that Russia moving its army into certain positions upset the balance of the Schlieffen Plan. They needed to do something, and General von Moltke wanted to move the army. What he got was a state of danger of war announced by the Kaiser, which is not mobilization, but it's a preparatory stage. On August 1, France and Germany declare full mobilization, and Britain decided to weigh its options. So it took another day, but Germany got its full mobilization. So right now, France and Germany and Russia feel they can't miss a minute. They need as much time as possible to get all their troops in place and follow up their war plans. France and Germany, when they declared the full mobilization, Britain weighed its options. Germany issued an ultimatum to Belgium on August 2nd, saying, let Germany march through unimpeded. Any reprisals will be seen as an act of war. They had 24 hours. Belgium refused this ultimatum, and at the same day, Germany declared war against France, and France had declared war against Germany. Had mobilized against Germany, but Germany declared war against France. On August 4, the British issued an ultimatum to Germany to cease hostilities in Belgium. On August 5th, Austria declared war on Germany and France and Britain and Russia. And on August 12th, the British and the French issued declarations of war. So, with that, you have the First World War. Now, is it the value of all these alliances that's really pulling them in? Well, there may be some of that, but what they see is that as soon as mobilization starts, they can't lose time. Even if it turns out that there may be peace, on the one hand, the feeling is that even they have to be prepared. Now, here's a little way of looking at it. What's going on? One way of analyzing what went on is to look at what we call the offensive advantage. And in this case, if we look at two sides, I've got Germany versus England. We could say it's Germany versus France easily. In fact, let's do that. Let's just say this is Germany versus France. FR. Okay. So we know both had war plans, right? And both were planning that, hey, this war, they figured out how this war was going to go. They already had their notion. The question is, what is in your best interest, to take a defensive position or preemptively strike your opponent? Now, even if there's no war declared, or so mobilize or defend, preempt or defend. There is a definite advantage in this situation to offense. As you saw in the principles, the major theories and principles of warfare, offensive, maintaining the offensive, the initiative, right? That's an important part of a victorious campaign. Additionally, because of the delicate balance of these plans, the knowledge of evenly balanced armies, similar weapons and weaponry and all that other stuff, you're looking for that massive advantage. And here is one way of analyzing it. So this is a little table here that we use in a branch of mathematics known as game theory. Now, game theory started as a way of analyzing poker hands, and it's become quite valuable in analyzing strategic and competitive situations. People use it in business, political science. Some historians use it as a way of analyzing competitive and strategic situations. But you're also seeing armed forces use this. Now, they weren't using this as a way of analyzing mobilization, but we can use it, and it becomes a helpful way of sort of explaining their thinking. They sort of come to these conclusions differently. So let's say Germany is represented, okay, here, and France is represented here. So France can either defend or preempt, and Germany can either defend or preempt, meaning they can mobilize their army and strike first. That means preempt. The payouts here, these little numbers that you see, the 1 and 1. The first number 1 is France's number. The second number 1 is Germany's number. Same here, 0 and 3. So what's going on? In this, and what does this tell us? In this game theory box, if we think of France, where are its best outcomes and where are its worst outcomes? So where does France do the best? Well, France, okay, preempts, right? If Germany decides to defend, well, France had decided to preempt, meaning strike early, and Germany was taking a defensive posture. It means that Germany has a terrible payout. It gets 0. France gets its highest payout, 3. France doesn't have a higher payout anywhere on this box. You have 1, you have 0, you have 2, and you have 3. So it really pays, France really pays off here. In the next box, okay, Germany gets 2, but you get 2. Okay, that's not always the great one, but okay. Now let's look for Germany. If Germany defends, it gets 1. If France also decides to defend. Where does Germany get its worst outcome? Preemption. If Germany preempts and France defends, right? Well, Germany gets its best outcome here because Germany gets 3, France gets 0. So if Germany preempts, France defends, 0 and 3. If Germany defends and France preempts, right, Germany has the terrible outcome of 0-3. And here may be equal, but it's better than what? 0. What's Germany's worst possible outcome here? 0. So the choice in these situations is you try to stave off, or you make decisions that would stave off the worst possible outcome. Which means that if you want to remove your worst possible outcome, if you're France or Germany, and you must assume that your opponents will try to do the same thing, removing their worst possible outcomes is here. So what will happen here is that France will preempt, Germany defends. Germany's not going to choose to defend, because when if it chooses to defend, it's its worst possible outcome. And since it doesn't know really what France is going to do, it has to make a decision based on imperfect information. So if I was to just cover that, blotch it out. We'll remove that. Now, if I'm France, how do I remove my worst possible outcome? Well, defending actually gives me my worst possible outcome of 0, and just like it did to Germany when it was their choice. So I'll make this 0. Okay, which leaves me some other choice. Now, if I have chosen to defend or blocked out defense because defense got me my worst possible outcome, that also means this brick of 1 versus 1, both decide to defend. It's kind of a silly strategy, but maybe possible. That's removed, which means the only strategy left is this one. Which means that no matter what, they will choose to preempt. Why? It prevents the worst possible outcome from happening, while also providing them a better outcome than the mutual defense. So, if we were to go back and look at that, not all game theory games work out as cleanly as this one. So, if we look at their strategic situation, preemption is important. And the only way to really preempt is to move early. Preempt, which means that waiting for politicians to maybe look for a calm before the storm and negotiate some more peaceful terms or limit the size of the war, that doesn't help make sure the Schlieffen Plan works. And if the Schlieffen Plan doesn't work, what does Germany do to fight a two-front war? You know, it's had people thinking about it for many years. How do you improvise that plan on the spot? So when you look at this as a way of analyzing problems, it also shows that perhaps, we look for the great causes, the entangling alliances and everything, and certainly they all had a part in it. But I think there's also a certain European arrogance here. When I say European, not in just indigenous to Europeans, but in this case exhibited by the European countries getting involved in this war, which is, we have to move, we have to preemptively strike, and this is the way to do it. And as you saw in the video, economists, bankers, and everything are telling people at home, don't do this. This is going to bankrupt us. Don't do this. And these countries still declared war, regardless of economic ties. So, as you peel this back, what you see is that for some, it's opportunities to get at Serbia and maybe knock it out. The Austrians don't really want an independent Serbia on their border, but there are still other considerations, like they didn't really want the Serbians in their own empire either. So, what do? As we've seen. However, what happened to them was a major humiliation and insult, and they wanted to return it. So, it's no easy solution, and there's many possible causes that you could really write up, as you see with Neil Ferguson and Sir Max Hastings' disagreements. So the other question is, was this war even necessary? It's sometimes so easy to say how inevitable the First World War was, especially after mobilization, but what we clearly see is that it wasn't. It's that people made choices. And generals, in some cases, had to wait for people to make choices. And they could have made different ones. And part of our job is to understand why they made the choices they made. In this case, I think it's pressure from their military people who they trust, knowing full well the precariousness of their situations in terms of defense. And so they decide to mobilize. Okay, the mobilization leads to war. In many cases, because you're mobilizing large numbers of troops, it's read as a hostile act, and you're putting them into a position to attack. So you have to mobilize your troops to counter that position. It's a very dangerous scenario. So hopefully this made some of the layers of causes of World War I a little more understandable. Thank you.